Good morning, everyone. So delighted to see you all here. Welcome to the launch of SOAR, and welcome in particular to all of our live streamers. We understand you're coming at us from 36 states and 9 countries and counting. So welcome. Our president, Dan Porterfield, is here just for a few minutes to welcome us. He's a huge supporter of this work, as is his beautiful wife, Karen, who's been a pioneer in helping us with this. But Dan, I wonder if you just want to say a couple of words of welcome. I know you have a big meeting you got to get to, so welcome.
Thank you so much, Peggy and Ann, and welcome to all who are here. This is obviously a big initiative for the ASP Institute, a big initiative for all communities around our country and around our world. There's so much talent out there to tap, to activate, so that we can make change that makes a difference for women and girls at local, community, organizational, national, and global levels. And the ASP Institute has a lot of tools in our toolbox to make a difference. It starts with people. Superb leadership, not only in Ann and Peggy, of course, but also in their incredible staffs, Laurie, Marjorie, Katie, and more. Please join me in thanking Ann and Peggy and their teams. The Institute has something like 550 employees. I'm not sure what our percent who are women are, but it's definitely more than 50%. We have about half of our group are millennials. Most of that group are women. We have an incredible team of women who are making a difference in society through their work with the Institute. This initiative really speaks to our whole staff. It also speaks to our board, which includes leaders like Madeleine Albright, Condoleezza Rice, Anna DeVere Smith, Katie Couric, all of whom are behind this effort and behind the Institute's commitment to drive change towards a free, just, and equitable society. One of the things that's especially exciting about the Institute's work, and the reason I really think that what Ann and Peggy have launched has a real power looking forward, is that we have networks all around the world of leaders who are making a difference in their communities, whether it's on the ground addressing critical health and well-being and women's empowerment concerns, or if it's at the level of organizational leadership or business leadership or political leadership. Aspen is a network of networks. And when you look across the thousands of people who take part as members of a formal Aspen Institute network, you're going to see women leaders all over, all ages, all backgrounds, all nationalities, all ethnicities, all sexual orientations, everything you can think of. There's so much power in the Aspen networks. Just to cite a couple, Ann has this incredible program, the Ascend Fellows, which gathers up all these leaders of all different types who are trying to develop family strategies to ending poverty, making sure we have equity across the board. One of her fellows, Mila Calhoun, is responsible for $200 million of investment in the state of Alabama that makes a difference for women and girls in big ways. And then Peggy's organization, Peggy's group leads something called the New Voices Fellowship, which finds leaders around the world, especially in the global South, who are putting it together to make a difference to empower communities, especially women and girls. It was through Peggy that I had a chance to meet an incredible leader named Thalmisa Hussein, who co-founded Voice for Women in the Maldives and gave one of the most incredible, eminent speeches I've ever heard about why it matters that we focus on climate change and think about the effects of climate change on her country. Extraordinary voices, extraordinary power. The networks the Aspen Institute has need to be activated still more intentionally through this work and the work of others and people like me to make sure that we are putting our shoulder to the wheel to empower women and girls. One last sort of example. We award every year something called the McNulty Prize, which singles out social entrepreneurs from our various networks who are driving change that makes a difference in real communities. This year's winner is Kelsey Worth, who's the founder of an organization called Mothers Out Front, which is focused on climate change and which partners with women in local communities, moms and grandmoms especially, in order to come up with a women's agenda on local empowerment to address the causes and consequences of climate change and the disproportionate effects that climate change will have on vulnerable communities, especially women and children. It's just, those three leaders are just a snapshot of what we have at this institute all across the board. And I really would like to again thank and commend Peggy and Ann for pulling it together. So thank you so much. Let's have a great day today.
Thanks so much, Dan. I appreciate you coming in to support this. I know you're such a big supporter. So welcome, everyone. We are really excited to officially welcome you to the SOAR community. It's important to note that in the almost 80-year history of the Aspen Institute, this is the first women-only focused initiative ever. So I don't know why it took so long, but we better take the stage in a forceful way. But we're really delighted to welcome you and all of you who are with us on live stream. So I'm Peggy Clark. I'm Vice President of the Institute and Executive Director of Aspen Global Innovators Group. And I'm really proud to lead the Aspen Institute Forum on Women and Girls with my colleague Ann Mosley, who is a great partner. We had the same mentor many years apart, but we always knew we wanted to work together, and we've been wanting to do this for some time. So SOAR is a new initiative of the Institute, and the vision of SOAR is really to lift up and support courageous and inspiring leaders across generations, across countries, across regions, across diverse backgrounds, who are actively improving the lives of women and girls. And I think this is, no surprise to all of us, this is a really critical moment for women and girls everywhere. Never have we seen such acute mobilization and activism around women and girls' issues, but at the same time, many of our fundamental rights and opportunities are being denied to us or rolled back. And we only need to look at the headlines of today: the legal victory in the Harvey Weinstein trial, a step towards addressing gender-based violence, which finally created a small crack in the armor of male impunity for crimes against women, to the fury and discussion around whether the U.S. is ready for a woman president and what kind of likable she needs to be for that to be so, to continued state-sanctioned limitations that make it really difficult for women and girls all over the world to go to school. So these are the pictures of our world today, where we have been told it will take more than 200 years before we reach gender equality. So that's more than 3 generations. What that means is your children's children's children may be beginning to see gender equality. And we know that's not okay, because women are at the center of healthy societies. So in response, we're launching the SOAR initiative in a year that marks significant milestones for women. This year is the 100th anniversary of the suffragettes, when many women were given the right to vote. We're also celebrating the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Fourth World Conference on Women. And these milestones remind us that when we get together, we're pretty much unstoppable. So welcome to all of us who are beginning to gather that momentum. It was so when we got the vote that women gathered together and pushed for change. It was so when close to 40,000 women gathered in Beijing and left with the boldest blueprint and platform to advance the rights of women and girls in our lifetimes. And it was in Beijing when we agreed that we want to create a world where all women and girls have the right to live free from violence, that women have the right to earn equal pay for equal work, the girls have the right to go to school. And today, 25 years later, we know there are still so many of these issues that are not addressed. There are many women who can't break the glass ceiling to hold leadership positions in business or politics. There are many women who are denied access to economic opportunities. And there are many, many women that suffer from violence and other discriminations. So we urgently need leaders who are ready to face long odds with fortitude, to see challenges as problems to solve, and who reject the notion that this is just the way things are. So SOAR is about creating space for this, for women's leadership, for women to be leaders, all of us to be leaders, whether you're a nurse, a graduate student, an NGO leader, or the Speaker of the House. And SOAR is creating space for us to learn from each other, to amplify our best practices, and to encourage each other to use our power to make the world a better place. So in my own life, I was lucky enough to have the opportunity to work with Mary Robinson, who was the first president of Ireland, and in fact, one of the first women presidents in the world. And we created an activist organization called Realizing Rights. So I learned many, many things from Mary, but the most important was, and it's a simple one, but it's the hardest one, take the power. Just lean into it. No one is going to give it to you. You need to just step forward and live into that power or create that power. And so that is what I invite all of you to do as you're with us today, as you're with us in all of the SOAR gatherings that we are joining together. As a community, we'll come together several times over the year. We have some really incredible speakers who will be joining us. We also have incredible online resources. Many people are hosting watch parties in different universities and cities and living rooms. We have action toolkits for you to participate in. And we know there's power in numbers. And today's gathering already shows, for all of us who are here today, that we're willing to step forward and do our part. So I thank you for that. So let me begin by encouraging all of you that are watching online to follow with the hashtag WeLeadWeSoar, and to Twitter at Aspen Institute Forum on Women and Girls, AIFWG. Now, it's my great pleasure to recognize a couple of the Aspen colleagues who've been really with us on this journey. And surprisingly, when we started this initiative, Ann and I, people from across the Institute were raising their hands and saying, yes, I want to join, me too. I want to particularly recognize Nikki Petrie from the Center for Native American Youth. Nikki, thank you so much for being a part of the SOAR Fellowship team. And Danielle Buisson, I don't know if Danielle's here, from our executive team. They've been wonderful partners, as well as the Ascend Fellows and the New Voices Fellows. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce a wonderful friend, our co-chair, Lola Adedokin from the Doris Duke Foundation. Lola is a really incredible force for good. Since joining the foundation in 2007, she's had a phenomenal track record. She leads and shapes groundbreaking strategy and management of the African Health Initiative. And in 2014, she became the program director for the Children's Wellbeing Program, which she leads. She's been an outspoken advocate for effective and diverse leadership to propel the changes we need to see in the world. She's a visionary partner for us. She believes in us, which is one of the most important gifts you can give anyone. And thank you, Lola. I want to turn it over to you to tell us a little bit more about SOAR.
What a welcome. I just feel so energized, and I want to shake my shoulders and take this moment. I'm really thrilled to be here today beside you, Peggy, and you, Ann, before this wonderful audience, some very familiar faces and many, many more new faces. And to those on live stream, thank you for joining us. Our mission at the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation is to improve the quality of people's lives by supporting the performing arts, environmental preservation, medical research, and efforts that improve outcomes for children and families here in the U.S. We know that to achieve this bold mission, visionary, passionate, and courageous leadership is essential. As Doris Duke exhibited in her life and in her legacy, the leadership of women in particular is deeply important. Before SOAR became a reality, we looked around the landscape of leaders and found that we needed a gathering space to inspire new ideas, new energy, and even bolder vision. We needed a space that brought powerful leaders together and gave them the time, the resources, and the platform to encourage them to make their visions a reality. We designed the SOAR Leadership Initiative alongside the SOAR Leadership and Fellowship Program to lift up trailblazing women, share hard-earned wisdom, and spur meaningful conversation and, most importantly, action. SOAR will ignite engaging and essential conversations around leadership, women's rights, civic and political participation, and economic justice. I'll take a moment, too, to recognize our male allies. There are a few here in the room. I feel like there are many more on live stream, but I thank them for their presence and encourage them to stand up, step back, and let us lead. Now, I'll turn to my fearless partner in this work, alongside Peggy, Ann Mosley, Vice President of the Aspen Institute and Executive Director of the Ascend Fellowship, who's been at the lead, charging us along. So thank you, Ann, for your leadership.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Lola. Thank you, Peggy. Thank you, Dan. And most importantly, thank you to each of you for showing up this morning for this conversation and for the work that you all do and have been doing and are going to do. I sort of thought, Super Tuesday, this is going to be a super conversation, and this is about a super frickin' future. Where really women and girls, through an intergeneration and intersectional and cross-sectoral perspective, are at the center. Because when we recognize that fullness, that richness, we are at our very, very best. And so Peggy and myself and our colleagues, and I believe Abigail Golden Vasquez, who is also a member of the team who stayed in before she heads off to El Paso, is on our design team, and also Eddie Ensenales and Dominique Dawes, who are on the Women of Color co-chairs. We're also part of this. As Peggy said, I'm going to get in trouble, as I always do if you've known me for a minute. I won't go into, because you can't sort of name everybody, but there have been so many leaders that just represent just what you all experience every day of women from all backgrounds who want to be part of shaping a different future that is just and inclusive for all. And so just for us at the Aspen Institute, we are thrilled to be bringing our full selves and this institution to the conversation to help lift up and amplify and accelerate good work that's happening throughout our country and throughout and across the country. So this conversation, the Institute was founded on the premise of great conversations and taking time for personal reflection and inspiration, and then, as both Peggy and Lola noted, action. We are funded on the Socratic method, which was really about living an examined life. And not only that examined life, questioning the institutions and structures that govern our lives, and how we do that from a sense of values, purpose, and also possibility. So Socrates might be Socratia in our world, but how we think about kind of claiming the space, both with strength and that sacred nature of the kind of conversations that we are going to be having throughout the SOAR fellowship and conversation. And that starts here today with our extraordinary panel. Our panel today, they're going to talk about their stories, their leadership journey. Each one of them are truly barrier breakers. Each one is confronting barriers with fresh energy and bold ideas, and in the process, they are changing the rules of the game for women and girls, and truly for this generation and the next. As we think about this work, how we also invite ourselves to talk about what does it mean to take those risks, to suffer those setbacks, but then to rise and soar above. Because if it was easy, it would have been done. And I wanted to share one little lesson where Peggy talked about her lesson from Mary Robinson, which is so important, about really claiming that power and claiming your moment. And I remember when I fell into sort of this work in some ways, when I had the privilege of working at the Women's Foundation of Colorado. And I had so many mentors. One, I never knew philanthropy existed. I didn't know this women's space had existed. But just where you have leaders from the top that say, claim your power, you can take that risk when you know that there are those that stand behind you. And so when you take that risk and having one another's backs and being able to have that cross support is really important. So as I think about the Aspen Institute and the work we do, I think about the beautiful visual of the aspen trees and the aspen groves, because they stand tall and beautiful and they live for hundreds and hundreds of years. And one of their strengths to that secret of success and longevity and how they flow with the wind. And if you've ever been in an aspen grove when the light is coming down and the leaves are tingling, and they can go with the weathers and the seasons because they are interconnected. Their roots are an ecosystem under the ground. And let us take that ecosystem that is under the ground and take it and make it the conversation in the public structure going forward. So I can't think of a better set of women leaders to help guide us into this conversation and kick us off than this morning. And so I'm going to start to introduce them, and if they would like to come on up to the stage, that would be fantastic. But as you'll see from each of these speakers, they represent not only their own story, their own strategy, but they also bring their own style of making kind of really social change. So first, I'd like to invite up Piper Kerman. Maybe most of you know her as the author of The Orange is the New Black and a criminal justice reform advocate. She has really defined the power of taking your personal story and leading it into cultural and systems change. I'd like to invite up Fatima Goss-Graves, who is the CEO of the Women's Law Center. The National Women's Law Center is really a policy anchor for all of us in keeping an eye on Congress and everything nationally happening. She is also co-founder of Time's Up Legal Defense Fund. Rohini Anand, who is the former Senior Vice President and Corporate Responsibility and Chief Diversity Officer at Sodexo. Rohini has been an extraordinary leader also in the private sector and in the employer space. And Sodexo, when we think about this arena, thinking about 480,000 employees in 80 countries and touching 100 million customers daily, how we think about scale across big issues like criminal justice reform, about policy change, and about the private sector. And then lastly, it's my total delight to bring up a shero in the media world and also a woman I'm honored to call a friend, Gloria Rivera. Gloria is an award-winning journalist on ABC. She not only is just cutting edge on how she's bringing up stories and coverage through the media, she's also changing the nature of media. She is co-founder of one of the leading training programs through Press Forward, really making newsrooms for the first time safe and civil and secure workplaces for all journalists. And she's also working on the first training program on sexual harassment in journalism schools, which just doesn't even exist when we think about the pipeline. So Gloria's pretty busy. And I'm proud to say that the Wall Street Journal was one of the first newsrooms to fully adopt her practices that she's been working on to make a change. So with no more ado, I'd love to turn the car keys over to Gloria and to these wonderful soaring leaders to inspire us and get us going. Thank you all so much for being with us. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much, Anne and Peggy and Lola. That was an amazing introduction, an amazing welcome for this group. It's so wonderful to see a packed house. I have to say that one of the first things I noted was that Anne had said this was to be a day about personal stories leading to professional growth and professional leadership. And I would be remiss not to mention that the first woman to ever put me on the air is here today, Kate O'Brien at ABC News. She also put my husband on the air, so we go way back. And she's been an advocate from day one for our work at Press Forward. So it's really those people that stand behind you who continue to support you throughout your career. So to that end, what I'm really excited about is that we have 3 women here of such diverse backgrounds. And I'd like to start with that question about the moment in your personal life when you began your career that really clarified the pivot you would follow. And I'll just ask that of you, Fatima. What was that moment for you studying law that led you to the National Women's Law Center and Time's Up Legal Defense Fund?
So I should begin by saying that I think I realized pretty early on that I wanted to be a lawyer. And in part, that was because I grew up hearing about the law through the stories of my family and thinking about the law as a possible source for good and a source for change. And
were your parents lawyers?
No, I'm the first lawyer in my family, and so, but my father and his siblings were the plaintiffs in a case to desegregate Knoxville, Tennessee public schools. And that was a really foundational part of our story. And when I was coming along, my parents had just a general rule that the work you do in the world is for yourself, but it can never just be for yourself. It's for everyone. And so it never occurred to me that my life and my career would not be in service of community. And I really grew up thinking about the law as this exciting, powerful thing that you could use for change and use for good. And when I went to law school, that was one of the first things I do. Like as soon as I learned how to use Westlaw, you learn that, and then I printed out the decision in that case. And
what was the decision?
we won. So the case is called Goss versus Board of Education, but I printed the decision out to sort of learn about my family story further, but also to learn about the law. So I guess I always thought of the law as a potential tool for good. It took me some winding around to find the job that I had. But even when I went to the National Women's Law Center, and I've been at the Law Center in a lot of different roles before being the president, I have to say that my dream was to be able to do this work in service of people, in service of improving the lives of women and girls. I didn't initially see myself as leading the organization. I was just happy to be able to do this work as my day job.
Great. We'll move on to you, Piper. So we know a little bit of your personal story, but where did the pivot take place? And I guess we could start with knowing you were going into prison, and how your perspective shifted during your time there, and what steps you took when you got out, and what led to the book.
As anyone who's a fan of Netflix knows, I was incarcerated from 2004 to 2005 for a crime that I had committed more than 10 years earlier in my very early 20s. And I was really fortunate when I exited prison that I had a safe and stable place to live, a pathway to employment, many of the very basic foundational things that every single person needs to be a productive member of society, which is barred from many people who share a felony the way that I have. When I exited prison, I was like, wow, that was the most messed up thing I've ever seen. And I really felt like people's comprehension of prisons, of prisoners, and of the criminal legal system more broadly was very inaccurate based on what I had witnessed and experienced, and based on what I had observed in the lives of all the women that I was incarcerated with. So, being incarcerated was my second experience of being part of a community of women, because I was very fortunate. I went to a women's college, and so that was the first women's institution in which I was held. And the contrast also, seriously, the contrast between those two very different types of institutions, a prestigious women's college versus a women's prison. And one of the things that I was alert to and interested in during the course of that experience of incarceration and exiting it was the fact that we build institutions very intentionally within our societies to serve certain people or to control certain other people. And there's often very little overlap. And I had that overlap, and I thought that that was an important place to speak from. Also, on a purely selfish level, I was now part of a stigmatized, marginalized group in terms of being a formerly incarcerated person and a person who had been adjudicated, right? I had literally lost some of my rights of citizenship. I'd lost all of my rights of citizenship during incarceration, but after incarceration, there are still many barriers to people ever recovering their rights of citizenship. And I wasn't okay with that. And I wasn't willing to sort of wear that stigma. And I didn't think that the women that I was incarcerated with should have to wear that permanent stigma for the rest of their lives. And so after incarceration, I thought about what I could do to affect change. And the only thing I really knew how to do based on my training in the world, which was all in communications, television production, storytelling, was to share the story that was authentic to me. And that's what I chose to do, and I was lucky to get that opportunity to do it. But I think the important lesson that women and girls can draw from that is to have the audacity to believe that what you have to say, your ideas and your opinions are important and are worth other people hearing. So, and I think that I came by that audacity, again, based on good fortune. I was raised by parents who were both feminists, my mom and my dad. I was very lucky to have a good, education in that women's community, which was so nurturing and encouraging to women of all walks of life. And I was lucky in the course of my professional life prior to incarceration to have some very good mentors and to get a lot of encouragement and to have been quite successful prior to incarceration. Most people think about my life after incarceration, and that's totally fair. But I was well prepped to come out of prison and be prepared to tell my story in a persuasive way and an audacious way.
Two quick questions. I remember early on in your book you talk about an inmate who talks about the Wall Street Journal with you, and that's sort of a breath of fresh air in prison to have that conversation. And then she gives you a hard time because you get something in the mail. Was it the Weekly Standard? And she says you might as well read. She gives you a hard time about something that you get.
Yeah.
But it struck me because it was a moment of humanity in a space that was quite inhumane.
Quite inhumane and quite, structurally reflective of the prevention of access to education, because 2/3 of all people who are incarcerated have left school prior to earning a high school degree here in this country. And these are structural issues, right? That's not a coincidence that failures in the public education system then result in things like disproportionate incarceration.
Well, structural issues brings me to you, Rahini, because I know when you started at Sodexo, it was because they had a very significant structural problem following a lawsuit. So you were brought in to, if you can just tell us, and also in the context of the personal story about what led you to this. You found yourself at Sodexo in 2000 with a great challenge. What do you think how were you equipped to handle that, and what were your years ahead like for you?
Wonderful, thank you. Well, I'm delighted to be here with this awesome panel and with all of you in the room, and really looking forward to connecting with you over lunch. So looking forward to some conversations. But my personal story is different. I actually grew up in Mumbai, India, and came to North America to go to graduate school. In India, I was surrounded by others who pretty much looked like me, and I belonged to the majority religion, but obviously many variations in education and socioeconomic class, etc. And when I came to North America, I actually first went to Canada. It was the first time that I was perceived as a minority, and I learned to recognize myself as such. It was the first time I was perceived as an Asian and learned to recognize myself as such, and the first time I was perceived as what they call East Indian in Canada and Vancouver, and learned to recognize myself as such. And with that came a bunch of experiences, both positive and negative, that really made me reflect on the privilege that I had had as being part of a majority, and what it means to be a minority, what it means to be a woman of color, and what it means to have all kinds of privilege, whether it's able-bodied privilege or privilege in terms of sexual orientation, being a straight woman, but most importantly, skin color privilege. And so that was sort of a pivotal moment for me, recognizing the privilege that I had had, owning the privilege that I had had, but also these experiences that I had as a minority woman. And that sort of led me to the work that I do today. So it led me to the work that I did on identity formation, and I went on to get a PhD at University of Michigan. But that wasn't enough for me. It was great, this was a path that I was following, and just, by way of context, I came to the US at a time when in India there were very few single women that came to North America. Certainly, education was a path for an arranged marriage, and that was what was expected. So this was a big step for me to kind of come out to North America on my own, to discover who I was, my identity, and then go on to really explore that through my research and the work that I did. But fast forward to the question you asked, Gloria, that brought me, so the academic part of it was wonderful, but it certainly didn't speak to what I wanted to do, which was really to change systems, to change cultures. And I did some work sort of as a consultant working for small nonprofits, but then got an opportunity to work at Sodexo. And this was 2002 at Sodexo, at a time when I didn't know this, when I joined the organization, there was a very serious lawsuit. And it was a class discrimination lawsuit filed by African Americans within the company. It was a promotion discrimination lawsuit. So about 6 months after I joined, it was certified as a class action. And so it was my job now, or I stepped into that role for really sort of addressing what the issues were. The company had sort of taken a risk in terms of hiring me as an Asian woman, knowing that the litigation was something that was filed by African Americans. And we'll talk some more about what I did, but it was about systemic change. But the lessons for me from that experience were just being grounded in your principles and knowing who you are, but also being very authentic in your leadership. Really being comfortable and authentic with who you are and your leadership. And then building allies and getting allies within an organization. Because for me, it was really critical to get the trust of everybody in that organization. African Americans, Latinos, Asians, etc. And that meant that I really had to be true to who I was, be authentic in who I was, but also build that base of allies if I was going to bring about the change that I needed to bring about in an organization, 85 countries, 480,000 employees, very unhappy employees at that time. And employees that were living in these sort of two different worlds. I mean, if you spoke to the white men in the company, everything was hunky-dory. So it was like they were having these completely different experiences within an organization.
And that leads me to my next question, which is about challenge, right? That's what Anne and Peggy encouraged us to look at, that when you reflect, you talk about white men living a completely different life to the other employees. How did you deal with that challenge? How did you unpack that challenge?
Yeah, so, I think there are a couple of different things. I think the first lesson that I learned was really meeting people where they are and, not passing judgment. I come from the belief that people don't know what they don't know, right? It's this sort of ignorance. And I think what you have to do is to really, make them realize that people have different experiences. So there were a bunch of different things that I did, but it really was around, understanding the what's in it for each individual. So if I think about some of our CEOs, so the CEO who hired me at Sodexo was phenomenal. I mean, he was my ally. He was, supported me, and that's why I could do a lot of what I did. But he moved on. We had another CEO. Now, just really quickly, this particular gentleman was one of the people who would sit in meetings and thump his fist on the table and say, pretty much like, get her out of here. It's just, this is rubbish. This is nonsense. We're not wasting our time. Fast forward, when he left the company and retired, the only thing he chose to do was to be an advisor on diversity and inclusion boards for companies. So there was this transformation that happened in him. And it's not a single thing that happened. It's a bunch of different things. But using him as an example, one thing that I did was to put him in front of our African American Leadership Forum. And he had conversations with them. And one of the questions, they asked him some questions, and he was livid. He said, how dare they ask me? I'm the CEO. How dare they ask me this question? Walked out of there angry. And after some coaching and stuff, the next meeting he went in and he listened. And his response was, he said, I have not walked in your shoes. Help me understand what your experiences have been. And he actually listened for the first time. And I think that just was, transformational in terms of the dynamic between our African American employees and him. So it was giving those experiences where he could actually hear what individuals had to say. But it's not just the personal piece. I think that's one piece of it, getting people to have those experiences. It's also changing systems and structures and policies in order to really ensure that there's some, to ensure that there are processes in place that don't allow unconscious bias to kind of come into an organization. I can speak more about that.
And we'll come back to it because I want to hear more. But it makes me think, so some of the things that I'm hearing are looking for the authenticity in people and helping to engage that. And I'm curious, in light of the Weinstein verdict last week, I've heard a little bit of what you have to say, and I'm curious about what you see as the main silver lining after that verdict and how it relates to the challenges that you've seen in your long legal career. We were just joking earlier that like if she goes back to the Supreme Court, they'll say like, we know you'll win, but that's not necessarily true. So if you could talk to that a little bit.
So I have to say that the Weinstein verdict, as we were approaching it, I started to get nervous. And when I'm nervous, I start to like plan, what are we going to say if he's totally acquitted? What would we talk about? And I have to say, I actually think one of the most important things that happened in that verdict, in addition to the fact that there was a measure of justice for these silence breakers who took a lot of risk in telling their stories at a time where it was very not popular to tell your story, right? And the last couple of years have been extremely hard for them, and nothing about that verdict restores their careers or puts you on a specific healing path, and yet still they did it, right? Yeah. But one of the things that was so important about that verdict was that we really saw the defense attorney decide that they were going to pull up every single old sexual violence trope imaginable. You know, sort of why were they in his room in the first place? What were they thinking? Shouldn't they have known? And is it really, you know, sort of really, if it was a test in many ways of whether culturally people were able to imagine a different story around sexual violence. Mm-hmm. And so that alone made me nervous because they had set it up as a debate squarely around whether this country was going to be able to move forward. And the jury clearly rejected that idea. The jury rejected the idea that we should be stuck in time to those old tropes that have like gripped us so hard. And so that actually is a wonderful silver lining to build upon. It means that we can now do the work of creating news stories around sexual violence that actually match the reality for survivors, right? So we don't have to have this caricature that leads us to do what we have often done around why didn't you report right away? Why did you still have interactions with that person? None of those things actually match the reality of sexual violence. The second thing is, I mean, if we've learned anything the last couple of years, it's that our systems are pretty broken. Mm-hmm. And so as we build them and shift them and drive a broader agenda for change, we're going to have to work within these broken systems. And so it reminded me that even within broken systems, you can sometimes win as you're moving culture. I'm deeply worried about the courts. If you're not worried about the courts, you should start getting worried about the courts. We can have that conversation later. Yeah. And you know, I think about the energy that is driving new laws at the state level, and it will be courts that are interpreting what those new laws mean. Yeah. And we have a Supreme Court that doesn't inspire a lot of good confidence around issues of justice at the moment. And so what I will say is that does not mean that legal strategies are unimportant. They remain important, of course, but it does mean that we have to really think a little bit harder about what our future court conversations are because we are not in a good place.
I just want to go back because you mentioned the Weinstein defense, and Donna Rotunno was quoted as saying to Megan Twohey, "I believe the actions of the women after the fact prove they were consensual encounters." And that was something that you quoted when you were talking about this, that's what's the jury has disagreed with.
And she talks specifically about those actions. The fact that they still interacted with him is an action that proves that you couldn't have experienced sexual violence when he was one of the most powerful people in their industry. That was precisely the problem. To get work, there are gatekeepers who decide whether or not you really are going to have a career or not. And so the whole framework, I mean, probably the shorthand, it was just sort of a victim blaming framework, but the whole framework is actually a framework that is well worn in this country. She didn't make up these stereotypes about survivors. She was not the first person to say them for sure. The reason she knew that she could say them is that these are stereotypes that people are likely to believe because we've heard them again and again. And what was important is that the jury rejected that idea.
Piper, I want to take it to you because I think much of what Rohini and Fatima talk about can be brought down to a much more tangible level with your experience and what you've written about. So they've talked about these large structures and the need for change and the fact that we have to work within them right now. We have no other choice. Rohini has managed, I sort of imagine the Titanic at Sodexo, turning this huge structure. You talk about the number of women in prisons having grown to 700%, having increased 700% in the last 3 decades, and the fact that nearly 2/3 of those women are mothers. And in your podcast, you take these topics, and one of them is touch. And I wonder if you can just talk about what you observed, the different policies different prisons have regarding touch, and also tie in mothers and how touch is so important for mothers in prison.
So the prisons as institutions and prison systems as a whole are built by and for men. Women being held captive in those systems is sort of incidental. And so as an example, I was in Kansas recently, and I was looking at some of the data around Kansas, and in 1980, there were 44 women incarcerated in the state of Kansas, and today there are more than 1,500 women incarcerated in the state of Kansas. So that gives you a sense of, what does this mean in real terms on the ground? So to go from literally 44 women who probably had all committed very serious capital crimes, though not necessarily, but chances are, to that kind of growth gives you an idea of how punitive the system overall has become. Last year, the House held a subcommittee hearing on women and girls in the criminal justice system, and one of the wonderful sort of policy wonks, data people, made a really important point, which is that women's experiences in that carceral system serve to really highlight the structural problems of the entire system. And I would say that that's true when you apply that to any number of systems in the world, that when we look at the condition of women and girls, it tends to be, sort of this acute example of broader problems, right? So, so if you're incarcerated and you're a woman, you find yourself in a physical place that was built to incarcerate men. You find yourself probably wearing men's clothes. You find yourself subject to rules, policies, procedures, which were not designed or developed with you in mind at all. And so it's my opinion that women and girls in a system like that suffer disproportionately, even than when you compare, the situation of those prisoners to men and boys. When you think about that sort of role of motherhood, my own experience and my observation from looking at what other women were going through also was that the things that are most foundational to people's comprehension of themselves in terms of gender, such as motherhood, for example, pregnancy, are in many ways sort of the grossest examples of harsh punishment. So what happens to pregnant women when they're in prison or jail? What happens to mothers, particularly the mothers of minor children, and to those children when those moms are incarcerated? Really highlights why the system is so desperately wrong. I think that these questions raise a lot, particularly when we think about holding perpetrators of violence, and specifically sexual violence, accountable. It raises a whole host of really serious questions because there's no institution more patriarchal, dominance-oriented, predicated on sort of the threat and the promise of violence than a prison. So what we have to ask ourselves as a society, and especially as women, is whether, my own opinion is that a prison is not feminist. Like, we cannot expect justice for women to grow out of a carceral system, and that is a really provocative and foundational challenge to the status quo, right? We have these systems which have been developed, and again, if you want to stay grounded in the legal system, the building blocks of our legal system in this country and in many other parts of the world, those building blocks are colonialism, racism, patriarchy. So how are we going to adapt or change those systems in a way that they can ever actually serve everyone instead of only serving those who are already in power?
What do you think of Van Jones's involvement in the First Step Act? It just, you mentioning change to the system, right? He's advocating for the First Step Act would make it illegal to shackle pregnant prisoners, release more informed or elderly prisoners, place inmates in facilities closer to their families, and increase the number of days inmates can spend in halfway homes or home confinement. But he's gotten a lot of pushback from the NAACP, from the ACLU on it not being enough.
I think also he's gotten a lot of pushback because he's collaborated with people who put children in cages, right? That's a big part of some of the pushback. So the first step, I myself was in federal prison, and so I am very happy and grateful for any federal prisoner who has received some sort of sentencing relief appropriate to their individual case. And the measures in the first, it's called the First Step Act for a reason, as an acknowledgement that it is a very, these are baby steps. We could call it the Baby Step Act. People also need to know that the vast majority of incarcerated people in this country are in state prisons or in city and county jails. So most people who are incarcerated are not in the federal system. And again, to come back to some of the issues that confront all of us, people who are held in particularly state prisons are often convicted of more serious offenses, including crimes of violence, than people in the federal system. I do think, though, if you want to know about why is that pushback a problem for someone who advocates for this First Step Act, it's because you're looking at who you have worked in collaboration with to get that statute in place. And so, one of the things that I think is so important for women and girls who are finding their pathway to leadership is the sometimes really difficult decisions of, like, who are your fellow travelers? Who are you going to choose to partner with? Which company will you pick in your own journey, right?
And that goes to, Rohini, what you and I were talking about in terms of both advice to women and girls and how you navigate your own path, right? Allies. So if we take it to advice in the context of a corporation like Sodexo, what did you come out of after your many years there in terms of what advice you would give to women and girls?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things, and I think sort of, both of you have mentioned some of them. So clearly the one thing that I said was be authentic in your leadership. Don't mimic someone else's leadership. I think all too often in organizations, there's one leadership model that people hold as possible for leaders, and that's very much of a masculine leadership model. But there are variations to that. And I think, if you can lean into what you feel comfortable with, what your authentic leadership model is, I think that's absolutely critical. I think I shared this story with you, Gloria, when we talked. So there was, one of the leaders in Europe, he was kind of, on the fence, and I had him mentor a woman from a different country. This was a sort of a reciprocal mentoring initiative. And at the end of the 1-year program, he comes to me and he says, and we're talking about prisons, right? So he comes to me and he says that, if you had asked me if there were 2 candidates, a male and a female, and I had to select the best qualified candidate to manage a high security facility, I would have chosen the man because it needs an assertive, aggressive style. It's a dangerous environment. You need someone who's firm, etc. He said, well, after mentoring this woman, Janine, who actually does very effectively manage high security facilities and has a very different leadership style, he said, I will never let that unconscious bias come into play in my recruiting decisions. So I think, being comfortable and confident in your leadership style is one. I would say that, you said, know who you're sort of traveling the path with in terms of allies. I think being able to build allies, because all too often as women, we sort of think that we have to do everything ourselves. We have to be 110% perfect. We cannot ask for help, but it's okay. It's okay to say that this is an area where I need some support. Seek out allies, because very often it's not what is said, but who is saying it that makes a difference. Mm-hmm. And the same message can be delivered and heard differently from male versus a female. So seek out allies in terms of supporting you for whatever it is that you're trying to do, the change that you're trying to bring about in an organization. I would say the other piece would be to get mentors. And I think that's absolutely critical, to be deliberate and intentional about seeking mentors when you join an organization, because I think mentors can do a lot in terms of building your sort of current skills, getting you more prepared. But equally important is to have a sponsor. And there's a difference between the two. A mentor sort of speaks with you. A sponsor speaks for you. Mm-hmm. And very often women are ready for the next step, but may not have raised their hand. So I would say that's another thing. Raise your hand. Take a risk. Ask for what you want. And that's a lesson I learned the hard way. What's the worst that can happen? Someone will say no to you. So big deal. But raise your hand. But I would say sponsors are absolutely critical, because sponsors are those individuals that really talk about you and advocate for you when you're not in the room. And I think having multiple sponsors, there's a piece of research that was done where they looked at what causes a woman's career to derail at a very senior level, particularly women in very senior executive levels, CEOs, etc. And the research basically said that they're smart because they get sponsors, but often it's that one sponsor. And when the one sponsor leaves, suddenly this career goes sideways. So I think getting multiple sponsors. So I think in terms of advice, I would say authentic leadership, build your ally base, but know who those allies are and who you're going to ask to be your allies. Get mentors, get sponsors, take risks, raise your hand and ask for what you want.
It's a very different form of advice than what I was given, which was to keep my head down and work hard.
Right.
Even when uncomfortable situations arose, it was head down, work hard.
Yeah.
And that's a radically different path. I'd also love you to just quickly share, I know I'm conscious of time, the story about, I believe it was going back to India and having this problem of the hours and the workers, and how you found an unsuspecting or a surprising mentor in them.
Right. So I think this is a story.
Yes, I think so.
So, I think, as I was listening to Piper talk about the systems and the prison system, and I think we're all about systemic change, but there is power in sort of stories as well, in terms of individual transformation stories. And I was thinking about going to some of the prisons. For instance, I was in Chile, and I was sharing with Gloria just, earlier that the prison system there is just so completely different from our prison system here. It's so much more humane. Women who are incarcerated are allowed to leave and go home and take care of their kids and do housework and come back at night to the prison. The ratio of kids to caregivers is 3-to-1. It's a cheerful environment. They have a separate wing for transgender prisoners. It's in the UK as well, where Janine works, which is what I mentioned. And it's just, the measure for success is the lack of recidivism, right? So it's really how you're able to reintegrate the prisoners into society. But so I think I'm giving those examples to say that, you're all leaders. you're doing global work. And I think it's really important to seek out mentors wherever you are, but important to listen and to be able to learn with a sense of humility. So I grew up in India. I went back to India to do work for Sodexo, and thinking that I knew all the answers. And I'd grown up, I know the culture, so I go there. We need to do mentoring, we have to have leadership development. And then I paused and I asked the women, entry-level women, what they wanted, what support did they need to be successful. And I was completely taken aback because they said, we live in joint families. And that's a story when we share it. We live in joint families, and we live with our in-laws. And if we can't work late because we're chastised if we go home late. When we go home late, we have to do all the housework and take care of our in-laws and everything, all the housework. So here I am scratching my head saying, well, I didn't expect that one. I had completely forgotten about that. But what do you expect me to do? So I asked them, I said, help me, how can we help you with solving this problem? So they came up with a solution. And they said, what we'd like is to have a day when you celebrate us, so have a recognition day, invite our families. So we had this big to-do. We invited the extended family in. We gave them awards, recognized them. And it helped to shift the dynamic at home, because now you had the mother-in-law who was creating all these problems for them, proud of their daughter-in-law, allowing her to work late, and actually doing some of the cooking so she didn't have to work when she came home. So I think the story there is also, as leaders, the ability to listen with a sense of humility. Lessons and learnings come from everywhere within an organization at all levels. And there's a lot that we can learn from outside the United States. And sometimes we think we have all the answers, but there is a lot that we can learn from outside.
I love that story. I think it's terrific. You called it a recognition day, right?
Yes.
And Fatima, it makes me think of some of your recent comments on arbitration laws and how companies, arbitration requirements rather, and how companies, you've also talked about the culture changing before these companies. So how companies will start, we hope, to shift those laws within the company. You said somewhere that arbitration requirements come as mere conditions of employment. Are we heading towards change?
I think we are. I mean, sometimes you actually need a story to illustrate how harmful a practice that's pretty widespread is. And what a lot of organizations do is, your first day when you're signing your paperwork, giving your social security or whatever other information, you also are signing a lot of rights. You're agreeing that you will arbitrate any disputes even before you know what you have a concern about. You sometimes are agreeing to a non-disclosure as a condition of your employment so that you will never talk about anything that happened here. And one of the things that we're finding out is that, people didn't even realize they had signed away all of these rights. They don't even remember signing this very important piece of paper. But what it means is that it silences whatever happened at that workplace. And it also means that if you were one day change your mind, right, and decide you do want to share your experience, or perhaps you don't want to do arbitration, which is pretty a secret process. You would like to do something, say, in federal court, that you cannot, that you are barred from doing so. Or in the case of non-disclosures, if you do break that non-disclosure agreement, oftentimes the amount of money you will owe that person is more than anything that you would have ever gotten for the harm you endured, right? So I actually think these are actually pretty common practices, right? And one of the things that's been important about the last couple of years is that understanding what this means in the context of sexual violence has helped people understand that it's a problem at all. So we've seen some states move forward with some changes to their laws, restricting the use of non-disclosure agreements. There are bills to restrict arbitration. and certainly make it so that pre-dispute arbitration isn't allowed. You know, it's one thing if you decide in the end that you want to arbitrate, go for it. But to have to decide that just so you can also do your job is a big deal.
Do you think that for so many years the common urging from many lawyers to accept an NDA was the right way to go?
So I have maybe a more nuanced view of NDAs than you might think, because you know I've had clients who want NDAs, and or who basically what they're seeking is an ability to go back inside that school or in that workplace and have this not be a part of their story. They don't want to talk about it, but they also don't want the institution to talk about it, and so they seek confidentiality. I've also had people who the big thing that they want is to be a public storyteller, and so so that's why the pre-dispute really matters to me around NDAs. That I think I just believe deeply in survivor agency and being able to drive outcomes. That said, one of the things that has become exposed is how much these NDAs have been abused and how they're written in ways that are so restrictive that you can't tell your mom what happened to you, and or don't even allow you to go to see a therapist. I mean, like there are some of these NDAs that have been really absurd, and so I think we have a lot of work to do to address them.
When thinking about this, I thought, what will this all look like for our children's children, right? When we've had generations of progressive leadership. And before we take questions, which we will, I want to ask Piper about what you see as the potential for progressive leadership. And I know you've spent time in a lot of different prisons, and you're teaching in one right now, right?
I taught for more than 4 years in Ohio, in the largest women's prison and men's medium security prison.
Right.
Yeah.
And there's a book coming, right?
That's true. Yeah.
Yes.
Mostly about the men's facility,
yes.
actually. Yeah.
What have you, I guess, silver lining question, what have you seen in terms of progressive leadership that gives you hope? And nothing is okay.
I think we're at a fascinating moment where an existing group of women leaders who have had to contend with systems that were not built by us or for us are facing questions about the compromises that they felt were necessary on their way up. You know, I think about some of the presidential candidates who worked as prosecutors during their careers. One of the things that I observe after returning to my close proximity with law enforcement is just how difficult it is for women to succeed at all in those types of hierarchies and structures. And the compromises that women, sometimes feel they have to make or have no choice about making, and some of the very creative ways that some women I've met who have worked in law enforcement, at the men's facility, a female warden was brought in 1996. The place had been totally off the rails for years and had been in federal receivership for 10 years. And she affected change in really profound ways. She took it from one of the most violent, dysfunctional prisons in that system to being one of the least violent prisons in Ohio. And she did that because she was trained as a social worker, and she did some very basic things around humanitarian action and changing policy and procedure within the prisons, within that prison. And she got results. And she got results that she was proud of and that the system itself was proud of. However, the system was content to have sort of one crown jewel, one shining example, and was not positioned or prepared to spread those lessons, policies, and procedures throughout the entire system. So I think the nature of our challenge is very clear, but I do think that women have exhibited plenty of ability to change those structures and to affect change. It is this broader question of how willing men are to meet us.
So what did that look like? And I'll let you get in just after me, but did that actually look like recognizing what they're doing there is working, but we don't want to do it, we can't do it, we don't have the structure here to do it? What did that look like on the ground?
Do you mean the
From other
resistance to
prisons.
stress?
Yeah, what did the
I mean,
resistance look like?
I think it comes back to those questions of one thing that all women and girls have to think about is their relationship to hierarchy. Hierarchy is predicated on inequality, and as we take roles of leadership, we all have to ask ourselves questions about our individual relationship to inequality as leaders, right? Like, what are we doing to make sure that our own actions are not oppressive to others? My personal critique of a system like the American way of doing prison and jail is that it is so grounded in hierarchy, so grounded in inequality, that we will never see women or people of color or any other marginalized group treated fairly within that system. It really requires a revolutionary approach to change.
Rohini, I'm curious if you think it might start at one point in the corporate world, because I know we talked about other companies looking at Sodexo, seeing, wow, what they're doing is working, and then trying to affect the same kind of change. Is that widespread?
Systemic changes?
Yes.
Yeah, I think it is. And I think that, corporations have stepped up at times when, we didn't have laws. So for instance, when you talk about our LGBT population, there are many, many companies that have given, healthcare benefits, have looked at all of the policies and made sure that same and opposite sex partners have the same benefits, leading in the United States. I think if you look outside of the US, it's usually laws that lead corporations, but in the US, I think corporations do step up to lead in certain areas, and this certainly would be one of the areas. So I think that companies are doing a fair amount in terms of systemic change and holding people accountable. So I mean, one of the examples that I shared with you was around sort of incenting managers, so putting their money where the mouth is. So you can have looking at your whole system and making sure that you've put in place interventions to basically address unconscious or mitigate unconscious bias wherever it occurs. So from recruiting, where men are often hired and paid based on potential, and women are often not hired and not paid based on performance. There are these double standards and the double bind that women have to go through. Either she can be nice or she can be efficient and effective. I mean, these things come into play in every decision at every stage of an employee life cycle. So putting in place processes to mitigate that, systemic processes, but also then, so to have interview panels, to have diverse interview panels, to have checks and balances, but then also holding managers accountable by having their incentives, their bonuses, linked to the actual outcomes. So, and that really does grab people's attention. Sodexo did that, and there are many companies that are doing that. Building it into your performance review process. You're not going to get a promotion unless you're able to demonstrate that you are developing and advancing women and women of color in the organization. So, building that into the processes. But I was going to actually say something, based on what you said, Piper. I think one of my concerns is sort of to shift the conversation a bit around generational issues. And I think that, we've sort of been in workplaces, and I'm a baby boomer, so basically kind of, fought the fight and stayed to change the culture. And what I'm observing, and I'm sort of putting this out there because this is really sort of an appeal to all of you in this room, what I'm observing is that millennials basically are not sticking it out. They're sort of, talking with their feet. So if they go into a workplace and the workplace is, built by baby boomers, for men, they actually are not going to put up with it, and they'll leave and start their own businesses or do something else or go to, to another organization. I think it's a big loss for companies, but I do think that we do need to continue to fight the fight. So.
I just want to check. I have one more question for you, but that's our total time left that you're telling me. Yes. Okay, good. So we will move to questions. So if any of you out there do have questions, we will get to you in one moment. But I just want to ask Fatima, what role have men played along the way to be helpful?
So I should.
This pause is concerning.
So if I'm being really honest, in this
Yes.
small group of friends and live streams around 40 states, it is, I expect men to do more than they're doing. We've had really the most vibrant conversation that we have had in a generation around not just violence, but really it's a question of power at work and in other institutions. And in my view, it really stands to shift our culture and institutions dramatically. Right now, most corporations are led by men. And there are some sectors in which there are very few women in leadership. You have to go pretty far down before you see them. And so we need men to be visible leaders. And there's a lot of fear, I think, that that's one of the things. But I also think there's too many male leaders who don't disagree, but who also don't see themselves as having to be leading voices right now.
Right.
And they need to. We need more of them. So it's not to say that we don't have any that are out there as allies, but what I will say is they should be deep co-conspirators, and as leaders of institutions that must change, they could be driving a path forward on what that looks like, and bringing their crew with them. So my answer is not enough.
Not enough.
And influencing other leaders.
Right.
Yeah. We have time for a few questions. So I think we have a mic. Yes, we do, right here.
We do. Can I start with a question from the live stream? And
You
then we'll
can,
do it
yes,
in room?
absolutely.
Since we did promise folks that we would ask the questions from online. So, one question from online is, should we continue to talk about change in leadership when change is just a better version of the past, or should we find something else that can work in the 21st century?
Well, I'll take a quick stab at that one. I think that we should absolutely continue to advocate for change, and that it will not look like the past. That change will be more feminine in nature, more empathetic in nature, and I don't think there's a choice. That's my take. Did I get that one? Okay.
Good.
Why don't we take one of these right here? This woman right to your right. Yes. Can
Hi,
you just tell me
I'm
your
Jill
name?
Gay, What Works Association. My question is for Fatima. So the UN Women has a global database of best practices on gender-based violence. Is there something in the legal system of global best practices that is a more preventive approach in all the issues we've been discussing?
Yeah, I will say I think some states are passing laws that are trying to get both on the back end and on prevention, but right now they're not great. There's some states that are requiring training, and there is, you could have a whole conference on the effectiveness of some types of training or not. And so there is some work that is happening. There's also some funding for both deep research and actually to support institutions that are driving change. But I think there's a long way to go on the prevention side.
And I just want to take this chance for you to say the stats around Time's Up Legal Defense Fund.
Yeah.
How many people have come to you? What that looks like?
So we launched Time's Up Legal Defense Fund a little over 2 years ago, and we've heard from about 4,000 people in the last 2 years, and we've been able to help people in 60 different sectors. And we're also able to fund over 150 cases. The majority of the cases that we fund are for involve individuals who are women of color. The vast majority of the people we have heard from identify themselves as low income, and we also know we are basically just scratching the surface.
Okay, another question. How about here in the front? Can we get a mic to the front? I know it's, there we go.
Hi, my name is Nikishka, and my question, and this is also a response to what you said. I am one of those millennials that actually worked in corporate responsibility for 7 years and then left because I felt like the change that was happening was too incremental, too slow to start my own company. The question is, and I'm hearing, I think what the conversation distills down to is, in this work of systems change, like, do we focus our effort on creating new systems and abandoning the current systems, or working within the current systems to change them? And we've talked about like Van Jones and the allies he's forming, or the example of the Sodexo CEO. When I heard that story, my thought was, why are we still letting white men, I know this was back in the day, but letting white men try to humanize them to our struggle, versus just saying, hey, maybe it's just time for a new CEO or a new leader, to put people in positions of power that didn't have that power before. So is there a danger in working within existing systems, because then we're not changing or not, creating new ones fast enough, and the change is just incremental?
Yeah, so I'll just speak from that experience, if you don't mind now. So I don't think it's an either or, I think it's a both and. Because I do think you need to work within the systems to get to breaking through the systems. So that example that I shared with you, working with him to get him to where we needed him to be. And then fast forward, we ended up getting a female CEO. So I think that's sort of an example of how you can sort of break through, work within the systems, but have your sort of a vision for what the end goal needs to be. So.
I would echo that you can't underestimate the power and the importance of these systems, and ultimately, like, we can't just sort of abandon them. We have a legal system, we have an educational system, we have a business sector. We need inside-outside strategies. The more that inside and outside strategies can recognize one another and, to whatever extent is possible, collaborate on shared goals. I think the inside folks, if you are pursuing a leadership path that takes you inside of one of these hierarchies, if you want to work within the legal system, within an educational system, what have you, I think people need to be extremely mindful of the change the system will enact upon them, and have a set of principles, practices, and strategies which are individual, back to Rahini's point about authenticity, personal authenticity. I think of this a lot when I think about the women I now know, sometimes very closely, who work in law enforcement after those 4 years that I spent every single week in those prisons. And some of the women working in those systems were my biggest collaborators. And hearing about sort of their lives and their work histories, many of them being close to retirement after 30 years, was really, really interesting, because many of them had gone through sea changes around their own ideas and attitudes about the system that they served, about their role as leaders, their role as women, what impact their work was actually having. They had a lot of questions about those things. And it is an incremental process, but we can't simply abandon the systems. That's just not pragmatic.
Can I add one more thing to this? And I'm definitely not a sort of anti-institution, as someone who works and leads an institution and works within the law. And part of the reason that I'm not is because I think of institutions as containers. And there is great ability to drive change within a container because there's a community, right? It is much harder to drive sort of societal, cultural change that lasts, that is sticky, without the wraparound of things like laws, rules, and institutions to bound it. And you need the other part of it to continue to push institutions. And so the way that I think about it is you need people in multiple roles. And there are lots of times people who are in institutions who say, this is not the space where I want to drive change. I want to drive change as either independently or where I am leading, right? And I think that's both fine and great, but I think you also need both. When and where it's working well, you have a bunch of different types of actors in our ecosystem working together with the hats they wear.
Is there a commonality in who you find pushing back? Like when you're engaged in advocating for change in any industry, I'm making this up. Is it the warden of a prison that's a problem? Is it like, go
I
ahead.
can offer you a very clear example. So I've been so fortunate, the book was published in 2010, the show, et cetera, et cetera. And for me, as an individual, as a leader, as a person, that has afforded me the opportunity to speak not only with, folks out in the community, but with systems practitioners. And I've been so lucky in that regard to be asked to come and talk to, judges, to, certainly correctional professionals, to, parole and probation professionals. I've talked to almost every group within the system of system actors, except for prosecutors. There's one group which has never exhibited any interest in hearing anything from me, and that's the most powerful role in the system, which some judges might, shed tears over, but it's true in terms of how the American criminal justice system works. By far the most powerful actor is the prosecutor, right? So it is a power analysis, back to your point, that the person who's gaining the most from the status quo is probably going to be your biggest challenge, right?
And it's so interesting to hear that mention of power. We haven't talked about power at length today, but it's at the foundation of all of the change that we talk about. Another question over here. Let's go right here.
Can you hear? Okay, there you go. Hi, my name is Eliel Peterson, and I'm a current senior at the Murray School. And I just have a quick question about what you think, first of all, thank you for coming, by the way, what you think as women and changes that could occur as women as we continue to fight for equal pay, but also recognizing that there's a huge disparity in terms of that as like Black women and Latina women being paid less than white women, and what changes do you think need to occur as we're continuing fighting for that as women in allyship?
Great question.
So I thank you for your question. I will say first that one of the changes that it took too long for us to make was to get people to understand that there's a wage gap, all women and all men, but there are wage gaps, right? And so even having visibility and recognition of the fact that we don't even reach Latina Equal Pay Day until like Thanksgiving was really, really important for people to understand, and what that meant to lose basically $1 million over the course of a lifetime. Those were like shocking numbers. The second thing is there are some changes that I think will help all women and really help workplaces generally around doing things like increasing transparency around pay. And when your point earlier around sometimes companies are just doing it, it is true. There are a few companies in tech basically that are just doing it, but mostly they are not doing it willingly. And laws changing is prompting important changes around pay transparency, important changes around how it is that people set pay, right? Like the back and forth over salary negotiation. But one of the largest drivers of the pay disparity for brown and Black women is really concentration in jobs that pay very little, right? Black and brown women are dramatically overrepresented in each of the lowest paid fields, and really underrepresented in the highest paid fields. And so the solution there means that our conversation around pay discrimination and pay and equal pay can't be limited to when people find themselves in the exact same job. It has to be a question about how do you get more people into jobs that pay more, and also how do you raise the wages across our sector, right? So the short version is that there isn't, if you really are focused on closing the wage gap for Black and for brown women, that means that you can't start with a single solution. It actually means you have to have like a complex agenda that will drive more equity over time.
Can I just add briefly to that? So I think that's a really, really good question. And I think, your point about making sure that you have Black and brown women represented in if I look at it in the corporate structure, in core business roles. So you have to understand how a company makes money and make sure that when you do your career pathing, you're contributing to that, whatever that is, So a lot of times Black and brown women end up in HR, et cetera, which are not the highest paying roles. But the other piece is, and I think some states are implementing this in terms of not asking for your starting salary. And that's something that we have decided to do at Sodexo across the board. Because what happens is that you then just perpetuate that wage gap. So if you come in from another organization where you've had a lower salary, and this new organization says, I'm going to pay you 5% over what your salary was in the past, you're just perpetuating that wage gap. So not asking that starting salary, but giving individuals a range, that this is the range that we're working with, is another way to start to level that off. So.
And I'll just add, for Piper, one of your podcasts was about a woman who came out, started, I guess you would call it a halfway house or a house for women, because women will get out of prison, be given a sum of cash, but no other support. And it was just a really good story, if you could just share it, like what she saw happening in that house.
Yeah, I mean, the day I was released from prison, I was released wearing all men's clothes and with $28 in my pocket in Chicago in March with a windbreaker. And I was very lucky because I had, a fiance at that time who was ready to help me make it a safe, successful journey home. So Susan Burton, who's a total inspiration, an incredible leader, following her own, complex journey through multiple prison systems. LA, one of the biggest cities in America, had no halfway house that served only women, and halfway houses that are co-ed are really problematic places. And she literally just bootstrapped it. I just visited the house like last month. I'm crazy about Susan. And what's incredible about her is she just saw the need, like if you think about her leadership journey, and she wrote this amazing book called Becoming Miss Burton, which is well worth everyone reading. But she had a need. She saw that other women had that need. She figured out a way to meet the need, and it has just grown and grown and grown. They have multiple houses now. They just opened up down in Long Beach. They're serving a much broader swath of women throughout sort of Southern California. She's also starting a nationwide network of people who want to work to fulfill that specific need of safe and stable housing for justice-involved women. And the best case scenario would be that we could expand the support so that more women could be prevented from ever going into, confinement in the first place. But her journey is amazing. And the other thing is that they've been able to grow with her leadership. They've been able to grow so that they are able to meet more and more of the needs that women have, not just the literal roof over the head, right?
I feel like one message from that is that leadership is in everyone. And Susan is this phenomenal leader doing these amazing things. It's such an inspiring story. We have time for a few more questions. Kate, over here.
I'm Kate O'Brien. I'm former boss,
Always.
journalist, media strategist, and Smith College grad.
Yay.
My question is actually for Rohini, though. In your years making change at Sodexo, can you tell us what the most effective structural change that you put into practice was, and one that would have been or maybe is replicable across other corporations? And then the second part of the question is, who are your collaborators across corporations that are in this journey with you?
Yeah. So just, really very quickly, I would say there were sort of 4 key things that drove the change. One is getting that leadership commitment. It has to be driven from the top. It has to be role model from the top. People look to leaders, as their guides, and they copy what leaders do and say. So it has to be authentically led from the top, and I think getting that was absolutely critical. I would say the second piece would be ensuring that you're holding people accountable. So having the right measures in place and holding them accountable so it cascades down throughout the organization. And then I think the third would be ensuring that every point in your process was examined to mitigate any bias. And so looking at it, from end to end, from the recruiting to promotions to succession planning, at every step of the way, looking at it and making sure that you mitigated bias. unfortunately, one of the key drivers continues to be in corporate America, making a business case. Now I say, haven't we been there and done that? How many business cases have you heard for advancing men in organizations? Zero. Why do you need one for women? But it still seems to be something that people want to hear, that this is really good for the core business. And I'm tired of it. I'm done with it. But it still seems to be something that organizations need, and we continue to do it. And I do think that corporations mimic each other. So there is a lot of sort of exchange and sharing across in order to advance. And there's, so I speak a lot at corporations to executive teams to share the story and hopefully and bring in other CEOs to share the story. I don't know if that was your second part of your question or not. You were talking about
who are the people across the sector who are doing the same
good. Yeah, I think there are a lot of companies doing good work. It's in pockets. It depends on which industries. But I think there are, without calling out organizations, I think there are organizations that are attending to it. I think the area where we need to definitely do more work is around women of color. I think that continues because I think people kind of lump women together, not looking at some of the nuances that exist. So I think that's an area that needs a lot more work.
I want to get one more question from online, if we could see if there are any available online. And just to go back, I think it was Rohini who spoke about this with Green Biz, that 40 to 60% of female leadership is tied to a business incentive, that it shows an increase in annual profits. And it's interesting that at 60%, it plateaus.
Yeah, that's right. So this is a study we did, speaking about the business case, where we looked at teams that had 40 to 60% women and compared it to our key performance indicators. So safety, employee retention, employee engagement, client retention, and financial outcomes. Right. And what we found was that those teams with 40 to 60% women outperform those with less than 40% women on each of these dimensions. But when you get more than 60% women, the results start plateauing. So the point here is not that any one group is better than the other, but you need that optimal mix for innovation, productivity, and engagement.
Do we have a question from online?
Yes. So to build off an earlier component of this conversation, a question from online is, how can we help more men become allies? Specifically, what can men do to be those co-conspirators?
Fatima, men need to do more. How do we help them do it, or how do they do it?
Well, I'll just say a couple of things that are not super original. The first is they can use the platforms that they have, right? So if you're in positions of power or you have a big mic, using that mic to either make a point from your perspective in service of extending the culture, or passing that mic to other women who don't have your same platform, that's one thing that they for sure could do. But the second thing is they could see the call that the cultural conversation has really given us as an urgent driver of change. And so what unfortunately for some organizations, despite the cultural conversation, it feels like they're waiting for the cultural conversation to just end, and rather than using it as, and it hasn't been ending, right? There's been predictions of it ending, and it has continued to go on again and again. So they could jump in and sort of use this as an opportunity to drive institutional change. And then the last thing, there are lots of spaces where women are not, right? And so the real question is, what happens in those spaces? What are the male-to-male conversations that could look different on any number of things? But some of that sort of showing up as an ally and as a bystander includes showing up when nobody sees you doing it, right? And so there are lots of organizations that have really creative tools to help people have those sorts of really bold conversations that can feel hard. There's a great group in New York, for example, called A Call to Men that does a lot of this work. But I guess my point is how people show up in spaces where women are not, where there's no one who can drive a different conversation, really, really matters.
I think, do we have time for one more? We have 2 minutes, one more question. So Rohini, were you pointing out at the back there? Yes, okay.
Normally loud, that's funny. Hi, ladies, thank you so much. So kind of feeding off of that question or off of that response, I wonder, and I don't know if this is a full question or just a statement of thought, that when the diversity, equity, inclusion officer in an organization is usually a person of color, then they kind of become the face of that. And they usually sometimes feel like I'm talking to possibly a brick wall. And so sometimes I wonder if it needs to be more of an intentional effort in the corporate structure for non-people of color to serve in that position, to come more in to this role. I guess what I was thinking about, it was an interview that I heard from Dr. King when they were talking to him about the civil rights movement and how it really started to pick up pace when non-black folks were making the point of what they, obviously what the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was pushing for, that it took people outside of the black community for the civil rights movement to finally be taken seriously and even to get the attention really of at the JFK level. And so I just wonder sometimes about diversity, equity, and inclusion in the corporate structure in corporate America, that if a white man, for instance, were the DEI officer or the chief diversity officer, the presence and the reception that he would get walking into the room and making those statements would probably be very different for a woman of color walking in the room who is a woman and a person of color.
So I think you raise a really good point and a really controversial one.
Okay, then I'm going to sit down, take that off of the footage.
No, just at a very, very high level. I think you're right, and it does connect with the, what can men do and how can they be allies conversation. And the controversial part of it is the following. So I think there are two ways of looking at this, and I agree that I think we need to get, people that are not minorities, not women, to step into these roles. As I said, it's oftentimes who's delivering the message, and it's received differently depending on who's delivering the message. In fact, at Sodexo, when we started doing this global work in France, I actually chose a straight white French guy because I knew that was the only way I could get the French on board. So that was sort of a deliberate strategy. But on the other hand, you have to, the path to the C-suite or senior executive positions, and this goes back to a point that Fatima raised, for women of color in particular, has been the DEI officer. So now you have women of color saying, that's one thing I have, you're going to take that away from me? Women and women of color saying, you're going to take that away from me. But I think if we look at it in a more systemic way, you don't want women and women of color to be pigeonholed in that role. You need to get them into roles that are more mainstream, where they can progress. So it's a work in progress, but it's not, it's not without its pros and cons.
Yeah, I mean, I would only echo that for white women, for white men, it's a process of learning when to speak up and when to get out of the way and be quiet, right? And how to make sure that other people's experiences or voices or power are centered. And I think, that's a process of stumbling towards a better world. But that's a trial and an error process for white women and for white people of the full gender spectrum. But it's really important for white people to understand that that's a central charge for us if we want to have a better world for everyone, including our own children.
I can just add one thing. I see the time's up sign. Totally.
Yeah.
If I could just add one more thing, and that is, I think we need white people in this conversation. I think we need them as agents who are driving change. I don't know that they have to lead the whole thing. And so that, there is a question about who is leading versus who is in and moving the work. And, sometimes it might be strategic to put them at the very, very top. but I find it interesting that there's a presumption if they're there that they must be leading it, and that's maybe something we can sit with a little bit.
Rohini, it takes me back to hearing you talk about coming from India to Canada and feeling like for the first time you had to recognize yourself as a minority. And I can say that I look forward to that time in these capacities. And I want to say thank you to all of you. Fatima, Piper, Rohini, you all brought
Thank you, Gloria.
such personal stories in a very important context of professional growth and leadership that I hope is valuable to everybody here. I look out and I see our future leaders. So thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gloria, Fatima, Piper, Rohini, and for all of you for this conversation. We're going to transition to a celebration and an introduction to the first inaugural class of the SOAR Fellows. So I'm going to invite you all. You can come on, sit down, and we're going to share the spotlight for a moment. But thank you again for absolutely fantastic, inspiring, insightful conversation. I think you heard a lot of different themes here, and I hope for all of you, when I look about this room, and I just see and feel such incredible power and possibility. We have multiple high schools, corporations, organizations, policy centers, points of view in this room. And for you all really to take a moment and to think about your leadership and how you are going to continue to soar, to lead, and to amplify our voices and think about what power looks like for you, those that you touch, whether it's from the front, the back, the side, and how you think about the resources you touch. Because it's also how do we think about the investment of resources. And whether that's human, financial, social, all of that, but opening that up. And again, just a wonderful way to kick this off. So again, I really thank the four phenomenal women for really starting this conversation and this SOAR effort at the Aspen Institute off really in the right way. Because now we're going to really look about the SOAR Fellowship, where as we talk about the conversations that lead to action are one of the greatest means of ushering in change. And our inaugural SOAR Fellows are embarking on a year-long conversation and relationship with each other. As any fellow knows, I see two ascenders, Mila and Wendy, it's just but a beginning. These relationships don't end. But we know from experience that these sacred circles of fellowship are life-changing. It is where ideas form to dismantle inequitable systems, sometimes from communities you even come from to those that you are looking to change, where partnerships are forged that make an idea go from seed to tree to forest. We're surrounded by an abundance of encouragement, fear fades, and resolve grows. And so in this moment, as Peggy said earlier, the Aspen Institute might have been a little slow to the game, I think, to have our first SOAR Fellowship that is really focused on transforming the lives of women and girls here in the U.S. and abroad. And all of these leaders have proven that we're seeing have a career trajectory and are at a moment of inflection point in their hopes and dreams and their vision to think about their sphere of influence in the community and in their interest areas for work. We've looked for leaders who valued and have demonstrated innovation, inclusion, and a commitment to justice. These leaders, we worked with a team that was phenomenal, that represented the full sector diversity, full demographic diversity, and point of view diversity. And within a 6-week period, because this was a jump into it opportunity with our phenomenal partners at the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation to just launch this in 2020. We didn't wait for it to be perfect. But with the first cohort, as these folks knew, we're like, get on a plane. And you'll hear more from all sorts of places from across the world. But we jumped into the opportunity because there was no time to waste. There is just no time to waste. And we went from more than 100 applications, and you're going to see and get a chance to meet 12 phenomenal leaders that what comprise the first inaugural cohort. So I'm going to call them up one by one just to introduce, and I'm just going to give you one sentence, just a snippet of their vision. Feel free to tweet out how fabulous they are and how fabulous you are too, by the way. But they are representing 4 countries, Haiti, Rwanda, Zimbabwe, and the US, 7 states. They're representing different sectors, different points of view, and they're just absolutely fantastic. So I'm going to first invite, and again, hold your applause, but come on up, SOAR fellows, and so everybody can see you and get a chance to just start getting to know you. Quincy Brown from Upper Marlboro, Maryland. Quincy, you got, well, look at you, Peggy, starting it. Quincy, they love you. Quincy's vision was to fully realize the power that technology can have on our lives. It is imperative that individuals from all segments of our society are included in its creation, especially women of color, in shaping the future of STEM. Thank you, Quincy. Rebecca Dixon from Washington, D.C. Her bold vision for change is to end the income and wealth inequality caused by employment discrimination and occupational segregation by race and gender. Ashanti Golar from Washington, D.C. Her vision for change is centered around the work they do every day at Emerge and the Brown Girls Guide to Politics. She's advancing women's leadership in the political arena to ensure we have an inclusive democracy. Nikishka Iyengar from Atlanta, Georgia. Her bold vision for change is creating the next economy, one that is rooted in social justice and environmental sustainability by transforming the financial sector. Marc Julis from Mirabel, Haiti, is working for an integrated package of maternal and child health care from pregnancy through baby and mother's first year together. Jolie LaFrance, currently in Tucson right now, but she comes from the Crow Nation in Montana and is Upsalage, and she envisions a future where Indigenous women and girls are in leadership roles and feel confident and feel happy, loved, and are equally important and safe, and our land and our waters are healthy. Thank you. Constancia Mavodoza from Harare, Zimbabwe, is working towards accessible sexual and reproductive health services and rights for young people in Zimbabwe. Lulit Mola from Minneapolis, Minnesota, believes in investing in Black, Indigenous, and women and girls of color. She believes it is the ultimate equity strategy for families and communities to thrive in the U.S. Erin Oban from Bismarck, North Dakota, is creating a multicultural resource center and services that promote healing and building bridges between new Americans and more established North Dakotans. Desiree Shepler from Palmer, Alaska. Her bold vision for change is to reconnect the Alaska Family Services to the founding principles of the Matsu women coming together to lift each other up by convening and advancing diverse cross-sector women for stronger communities. Sion Johannes Waka from Kigali, Rwanda. She seeks the equal participation of women in academia, philanthropy, practice, and as decision makers in all aspects of community development. Welcome. Deanna Williams from Grand Junction, Colorado. Her bold vision for change is a community culture that empowers women and girls through sustainable education and employment, with a focus on early childhood education and the employment pipeline. What you see up here is some pretty bold leadership, some big ideas. I think we are ready. We soar, we lead. Welcome. As we think about Super Tuesday, I think we have a pretty super start with some phenomenal leaders, all of you in this room, and all of you up front. It is the pleasure and privilege of the Aspen Institute to have the opportunity, along with the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation and the support of everybody in this room and out there online, to support you in making your dreams a reality, because we will all benefit by leading and watching your leadership come into action. Peggy Clark is going to come up and officially close us out, but we are so delighted to have you all here.
Thank you so much. You guys are so beautiful. You have to just stay right there. Thank you all for being a part of this fabulous first conversation. There's some really fabulous, cool things coming forward in SOAR. I want to tell you about a couple of them. On March 20th, we have Susan Rice, the former U.S. ambassador to the UN, speaking about her book, Tough Love, with the incomparable Judy Woodruff of PBS interviewing her. This will also be live streamed and open to everyone. We also, on Friday, March 27th, you know, this is International Women's Month right now, we have the Aspen Institute Sports and Society program hosting an event, Future of Sports, if designed by women. That's intriguing. With professional runner Mary Kane and U.S. figure skating Olympic Gracie Gold, which will be fabulous. And then we have a really pretty incredible thing, which we are just announcing for the first time today. It's going to happen on July 29th as the second in our formal SOAR Leadership Series. And we will have the incomparable Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg join us. And each of these leadership series, these incredible women are going to have a chance for an intimate conversation with our leaders. So we are delighted to have all of you join us for that, and everyone online. Watch parties also encourage. We have action plans and discussion guides. We are delighted to have our wonderful Maya Calhoun of Alabama Power Foundation will be hosting us in Birmingham, Alabama, September 14th. For an incomparable set of conversations around women in the South. And then we'll be back again on December 8th in Washington, D.C. for the final of the fourth series of this first year, which is 2020. So we really encourage you to stay connected. Go to aspenwomenandgirls.org. We have a lot of really fabulous toolkits on there. We want to hear from you. We want to get you involved. There's a lot of other leadership resources. And then for those of you who are here in person, we have these really cool commitment cards. And the whole point of this is to support each other. So maybe there's someone in the room here who wants to do something powerful in their neighborhood or in their community or in their organization or in their place of work. We're all here to support you. So if you want to make a commitment, write it down and take a picture. What am I supposed to tell them to do with the pictures, guys? Tell me again. No. Tweet it to We Lead, hashtag We Lead, We SOAR. We'd love to help you with that. And there's a banner out front if you want to take a picture of that. And with that, we really thank you all for joining us for this first conversation. We'd love you to be a part of the community and give us your ideas about what more we can be doing together. Thank you so much.